Good evening and welcome to Spiritual Story Time. I'm Domo Geshe, and we have been reading Gesar of Ling for the past number of days, and this evening we're going to finish this story. I think I'm going to go on to read some more of Gesar of Ling stories, the great hero, and I'm curious what will happen here at the end of this segment. And then we're going to continue on with the other folk tales in this book, Tibetan Folk Tales, and I hope you'll enjoy those also. More short stories, and so that will be tomorrow night. So anyway, when we left off, that the Gesar was told that he had to find 8 treasures, and his meeting with Dolma, who came to his what do you call that? The place where he was banished to, and he received her whip, her horse whip. Obviously, that was one of the treasures. So she came to bring him back to run this race to become king of Ling. So well, let's see what they're going to do next. Yes, I think they're sweet on each other already. Gesar and Dolma realized that they were going to return to Ling in time for the race. They would have to ride hard, so it was agreed that Gongmo would follow on behind at an easier pace. Gongmo is his mother. As they galloped across the plain, Dolma felt very unhappy that Gesar seemed to think so little of her, that he could tease her so unmercifully. Gesar was thinking of Tonden, of his subtleties and tricks. There were, after all, many greater magicians in Tibet than the hermit Ratna, whom he had defeated 3 years previously. It occurred to him as certainly not beyond the realm of possibility that Dolma was a phantom, conjured up to trick him. He prayed that it was not so, for he knew now how he felt about her. But for this very reason he had to know, or the question would always be there. He spurred on his horse, whispering in his ear, "Gesar, Gesar, wait, I cannot keep up with you," Dolma shouted. Suddenly Gesar's horse lunged forward, its body like a clenched fist of taut muscles. Then to her horror, Dolma saw the horse bolt. She shouted, and Gesar shouted back at her, but she could not catch what he said as he struggled to bring the horse to a halt, pulling its head around to slow it. Dolma spurred her horse on. As Gesar's horse neared the long grass of the riverbank, a forehoof slipped on a marmot burrow, and the horse fell, throwing Gesar violently from the saddle. He disappeared into the long grass. The grass was so tall that for a moment, just after she dismounted, Dolma could not even see Gesar's horse. Then it staggered to its feet. She ran over to it and saw that it seemed to have no broken bones, but there was no sign of Gesar. "Gesar, Gesar, where are you, Gesar?" She walked slowly through the long grass looking for him, worried that he had been knocked unconscious, yet not able to put the idea out of her mind that all the time he was playing a joke on her. "Gesar, if you don't come out, I'll ride on without you." But her threat brought no response. And as the time passed and she walked on, Dolma grew more apprehensive. Then she saw his hand in the long grass. She recognized his silver saddle ring, and lying nearby, she noticed the whip she had given him. "Gesar," As she parted the grass, Dolma's mouth opened in a silent scream that took moments to tear itself from her being. It was Gesar's arm, but the grass had parted to show the bloody stump of the shoulder where it had been severed from his body. Feeling she was in some terrible nightmare and unable to understand how it could have happened, Dolma wandered through the grass. She looked down as she accidentally kicked something and felt it roll beneath her foot. She was looking into the lifeless eyes of Gesar's severed head. Her tears mingled with his blood as she murmured again and again, unable to believe that he could really be dead. Gesar, Gesar, do not tease me. Racked with grief, Dolma called on Guru Rinpoche for help. Her long black hair fell over her face as she looked down at Gesar's head cradled in her arm, tears nearly blinding her. Dolma? At first, Dolma thought it was her mind playing tricks as she heard the familiar voice. Dolma? She opened her eyes. There was no sign of Gesar's head or body. Dolma? She turned. He was sitting, restored and healthy, cross-legged and balanced on the slender curve of a 2-foot-long stalk of grass. Gesar, she ran to him. I thought you were dead. Dolma was overwhelmed with emotional flood of anger and relief. She pummeled him in a rage as soothingly Gesar tried to defend himself. Why, Gesar? Why put me through such pain? Why? I had to know, Dolma. He stood up and held her face in his hands. Now I know there is no deception or trick, that your heart is your own, and that I do indeed have it, as you have mine. Gesar and Dolma rode beside the surging river of the Ling Valley, its fields of barley ripe for harvesting. Even from a distance, they recognized the portly figure of Tonden approaching with a group of riders. Dolma hoped she would not be recognized in her peasant chuba. As the party of riders approached, Gesar realized that Tonden was looking at him and his horse intently, even while he continued speaking with the rider beside him. Dolma glanced nervously at Gesar and lowered her head. They eased their horses to the side of the path so that Tonden and his party could pass them without hindrance. As Tonden's party went by, Gesar bowed his head in respect to the steward and drew in his breath. As I said before, it goes like that. It's like I'm a lower person and you are most high, and so like that. It's kind of a slurp. Then, just as he and Dolma were urging their horses onward, Tonden shouted to Gesar, "Nomad boy, I want to speak with you." Gesar realized it was fruitless to ride on with Tonden's friends all around him. He turned his horse and, with Dolma following, walked the few yards back to Tonden. Gesar dismounted to approach, hoping his deference would help to prevent the steward from recognizing him. "Your horse is very fine," Tonden said. He was carefully appraising the horse. It was without doubt the finest he had seen, and he was remembering the words of the prophecy. Ride the finest horse in Ling to be sure of winning. This horse must be, he thought, the one he should ride. Tonden's companions had gathered around Gesar and Dolma, each voicing opinions about the horse. Gesar received congratulations on his mount, which inspired considerable admiration in all of them. Would you consider selling it? Tondon had little hope that he could persuade Gesar to sell it, as a fine horse was far more valuable than its monetary worth. If Gesar was unwilling to sell, Tondon thought he would have to think of some other means of acquiring the horse. Gesar politely discounted the virtues of his horse, explaining that Tondon's horse was better in various points. Tondon held out his hand, and Gesar took it. Tondon offered Gesar a substantial amount by the means of a hand grip, the movement hidden by his long sleeve. I have to stop and tell you, this is a very traditional way that they do the negotiations hidden under each of their long sleeves, and they're holding hands and they're making gestures to show how much money they're willing to pay. So it's actually bargaining when nobody else can hear. It's kind of very uniquely Tibetan anyway. Gesar declined, and so Tondon increased his bid until he realized that Gesar was unresponsive from lack of interest in a sale, despite being offered a fortune. "Kusho," Gesar said, "with respect, I do not wish to sell my horse." Tondon threw Gesar's hand down angrily. There was a hardness in his voice when he spoke. "I would like to try your humble beast." The breath hissed through his back teeth. Gesar paused for a moment. "You will honor myself and my horse." He wanted to do anything to avoid suspicion. Tondon's servants dismounted quickly in order to help the steward dismount from his own horse and mount Gesar's. "Where did you get this horse?" Tondon asked. "From my uncle. He has fine horses." "Why will you not sell him, even for a fortune?" "I cannot, Kusho. He is my mother's." "But I thought you said he came from your uncle." Tondon tapped a small jade bottle onto his hand and inhaled some snuff. "From my uncle's herd." "Would your mother think of selling him?" "She knows very little about horses, Kusho." "Then why does she need a horse like this?" Tondon sounded exasperated. "One does not only have what one needs in this life," Gesar replied. "Can you tell her I am interested in buying her horse? I will not be seeing her for some 6 months." "You are on pilgrimage?" "Yes," Gesar replied. "But my mother does not know anything about horses." "But since she owns it, I would have to buy it from her?" Tondon asked. "Well," Gesar sounded thoughtful, "she would ask my opinion. I am the only one who really knows about him, since I ride him." "But you said he wasn't your horse." "He isn't." Tondon was growing angrier by the minute. "I have already asked you if I can buy the horse from you." "Well," Gesar said, that would depend upon my uncle." "But you said your uncle had given the horse to your mother." He has. "Then explain to me." "My uncle wants to breed from the horse. So I have to ask your mother, who will ask you, who will ask your uncle. But your uncle will have to ask your mother, who will ask you." "Yes, Kusho." Gesar smiled. Tonden hit the horse with his whip, determined now that he would have it, and mentally cursing Gesar for all eternity. As he rode past, some of his companions pointed at the horse. Tonden reined in and asked them what they had seen. The horse has a double joint. Tonden did not believe them and got Gesar onto the horse so he could watch its movement closely. To his horror, he saw that the beautiful beast did indeed have a double joint. It would be hopeless for racing, Tonden thought, and felt even angrier that he had not noticed it earlier and had wasted so much time. His friends were clearly finding the whole thing hilarious. Feeling humiliated and uneasy, he climbed back onto his own horse and urged it on at a rapid pace. Doma rode beside her father, dressed in her festival clothes and attended by their household, listening to the dull echo of their horses' hooves in the deserted town square as they rode to join the townspeople camped at the picnic ground for the start of the race. Doma's father looked across the square at the large carved and gilded throne set up on the temple steps, awaiting the winner, and beside it the slightly lower throne for the new Queen of Ling, Doma. His daughter, Queen of Ling. He glowed with pride when he looked at her. Already she looked the part in a chuba of brocade satin edged with otter fur, her hair in 100 plaits gathered into a single braid and interwoven with ornaments of turquoise and coral. Looking at the empty thrones, Doma felt both apprehension and excitement. Her father had promised her to the winner of the race. If it was not Gesar, she would lose him forever, but if she won, she knew she would be his wife and queen. The rolling turf of the picnic ground on the outskirts of Ling was churned up by the 500 horsemen, milling and shouting as they attempted to get all of their horses lined up beside the shallow stream, which was the starting line. Almost the entire population of Ling had come out to see the race. Many families had set up their picnic tents, which were decorated with brightly colored felt designs, and innumerable fires heated cauldrons of water for the enormous teapots. The 2-day-long race had become a festival for the whole country, and everyone was dressed in their finest clothes. When they were not watching the race, it would be a time for dancing, singing, feasting, drinking, and gaming. Tonden glanced up at the monks setting up the ancient cannon on the monastery ramparts in preparation for the starting signal. A groom led his horse through the crowd toward the edge of the stream. Many people had been unhappy that Tonden was participating in the race, for some said that such a powerful figure would put everyone else at a disadvantage. But Tonden realized very rapidly that no one was going to allow him to win the race out of awe or respect for his position or rank. Those men who courteously acknowledged him before the race, Tonden was quite aware, would fight him relentlessly during it. The steward smilingly acknowledged the greetings, and then his smile froze as he noticed someone on a horse a few yards away. It was the young nomad boy he had seen the day before. Tonden was very puzzled to see that his horse appeared to be perfectly fit, with no sign of a double joint. It was, as he originally thought, a superb horse. Even as he realized this, Tondon also recognized the boy's smile and the look in his eye. Tondon moaned aloud. Gesar had returned. The cannon on the wall of the monastery was fired in a cloud of billowing smoke before anyone expected it, startling some of the horses so that at least 20 of the riders were thrown at the starting line. The rest of the competitors careened across the stream, and in the jostling mass, more riders and horses fell. The terrain was such that the winner of the race would not necessarily be the fastest runner, but the toughest, the best able to endure the pressure of the race and the harshness of the course. Tondon had made careful preparations. Along the route were grooms and servants, carefully disguised as farmers, pilgrims or monks with refreshments and even fresh horses. Even though the gods had assured him that he would win, he believed it was up to him to make sure he would realize the prophecy. Gesar had made a very poor start. Hemmed in at the back of the mass of horsemen, he had been brought down within seconds of the start by a falling horse. Some hours later, he adjusted the eye shade of fringed cloth, which protected his eyes against snow glare, as he plodded toward the mountain pass. The snow was churned up with hoofprints and the footprints of other competitors. A handful of riders were scattered over the mountain, wearily climbing the track toward the pass. Gesar paused to give his horse some tsampa, then chewed a cube of dried cheese. At noon, the sun was harsh. Gesar and his horse walked with dragging feet along the edge of a lake, so vast that he could not see the far shore. He wore his sheepskin chuba with the sleeves tied round his waist, leaving his torso bare to the sun. Gesar looked longingly at the water, so enticingly refreshing, but it was salty and undrinkable. About 100 yards ahead, Gesar saw 3 other competitors. One, too exhausted to walk, was riding a horse that looked ready to drop. As Gesar walked through some apricot trees, he saw a strange figure sitting on a medong, a wall of stone engraved with invocations. Drawing closer, Gesar realized that the young man was a hunchback, his body twisted and contorted so that it appeared as if one side of it had been lifted higher than the other before his bones were set, giving him a hump, a limp, and leaving his head on one side. But the young man had a cheerful countenance and greeted Gesar while he filled his hat with water from a large container and gave it to his horse to drink. Gesar looked longingly at the water bottle as he walked up to the young man. The hunchback smiled and offered the bottle to the youth. When Gesar had given his horse a drink from his cupped hands, he took some himself. Gesar was exhausted and, looking at his horse, knew that they had to rest if they were going to have any hope of going on. He sat on the wall with the young hunchback and felt utterly drained of energy. "What is your name? Mine is Gesar." "Greetings, Gesar. I am Chamba, the riddle maker." Gesar laughed at the man's title and, nodding his thanks as the young man handed him the water bottle again, took another drink. While he drank, Gesar took in the young man. He was dressed very colorfully, with a red chuba, saddle rings on every finger like a nomadic bandit, and a beautiful bow and quiver of arrows. The quiver especially caught Gesar's attention. It was covered in shark skin and bound in silver. "Tell me some riddles," Gesar said as he handed the water bottle back. The young man laughed. "No, I shall tell you of the possible that is impossible, or the impossible that is possible." He laughed again, and Gesar thought that he must not stay too long or he would lose the ground that he had made up. "How could one louse fill your hand to overflowing?" "How?" Gesar asked. "Why, if its muscles are unraveled, they will fill both your hands." Gesar pulled a wry smile. He saw a rider approaching in the distance. "How," the hunchback asked again, "can one ant fill a tsampa bowl?" "I do not know," Gesar said. "The drop of blood from an ant's nose will fill a tsampa bowl." The rider was fast coming up to them. Gesar, instead of feeling refreshed, was feeling more and more tired. "You talk nonsense," he said. He tried to walk away from the wall, but found that he was too weak to do so. As he glanced at the hunchback, the young man smiled back at him with his curious laughter. The rider cantered past. "But you must hear the third impossibility." "Well," Gesar said, and tried to summon up all of his energies. "A magpie that gives birth to a baby and gives it milk." "It is not hard to think of impossibilities, riddle maker." "But mine are possible. Think carefully." Gesar shook his head in disbelief. He was so tired. "Tell me 3 things sharpened by nature." "I don't know." Gesar wanted to get on, if only he could get up enough energy. He forced himself off the wall and stood up. "A tusk, a horn, and a splinter of wood." Gesar smiled and tightened the girth of his saddle as the young man limped across to help him. Swiftly he slipped a burr beneath the woven saddle rug. Gesar swung up into the saddle and was about to bid farewell to the hunchback when his horse, reacting against the pain of the burr, lashed out with its hindquarters, catching the hunchback in the side and knocking him into the lake. "Help me," the hunchback yelled. "I cannot swim. Help me." Gesar quieted his horse, jumped down from the saddle, and saw a thin trickle of blood oozing from beneath the saddle rug. He felt beneath it. "Shall I help you?" Gesar angrily shouted, "as you have helped me?" He held aloft the burr. "Please," the hunchback was treading water and managed to grab hold of a slippery rock to which he desperately clung. I had to do it. I am sorry, but the steward Tonden ordered it." Gesar walked to the edge of the lake, looked calmly at the struggling hunchback, tossed the burr into the water, and said, "We will strike a bargain. For your fine quiver, I will rescue you." "Anything," the hunchback gasped. His hands slipped on the rock. "Help me." He disappeared beneath the water. Gesar took the rope from his saddle and hurled it out into the water. It was quickly grasped by the hunchback, and Gesar pulled him onto the bank. As he lay wet and frightened on the ground, Gesar took the quiver from him, slung it over his shoulder, and remounting his horse, spurred it into a gallop to catch up with his competitors. He had found another of the treasures of Guru Rinpoche. When dusk fell, Gesar rode on through the night with only the pale, ghostly light of the moon. Sometimes when it disappeared for minutes behind the clouds, his horse would stumble its hooves slipping into one of the holes of the tailless rat warrens. Gesar slackened his pace, but still rode on. It was some hours after midnight when he was riding through a wood that he saw in the shelter of some rocks the glimmer of a campfire. Gesar approached cautiously. It was unusual for a fire to burn brightly at this hour, and who could say what evil spirits might be abroad waiting to catch the unwary traveler? As he drew closer, Gesar saw the glint of firelight on the long blade of a sword held at the ready. "Do not fear," he shouted. "I am one of the competitors in the Ling race. Who are you?" Gesar was by no means certain that the sword was only for defensive purposes. A gravelly woman's voice answered, "Come into the light where I can see you." Gesar dismounted and, leading his horse, walked up to the lone figure beside the campfire. She was a plump, middle-aged woman. Her chuba bag was stuffed full, and she carried 2 sets of saddlebags filled with equipment and medicines of a doctor. As the doctor sheathed her sword, Gesar had no doubt as to her capacity with it. She heated water on the fire for tea, and he unsaddled his horse to give it a rest. As he talked with the doctor, he was increasingly fascinated by her hat. Like a giant bird's beak, it was made of tightly woven bird's feathers. They appeared to be in the form of cloth, so closely did one feather lie against the other. The doctor, Gesar discovered, was on her way to a nomadic encampment for the winter. After they had eaten and talked for a while, Gesar asked for the doctor's opinion, saying that he had felt unwell for some time. The doctor gave him a thorough check, gently feeling the subtle veins of energy in his body, and eventually declaring him to be perfectly healthy. Gesar accepted this doubtfully. A short while later, Gesar said he definitely was not well. Again, the doctor wearily went through her tests, and again she reassured him that there was nothing wrong with him. "But now I feel there must be. Why would the upper part of my body feel like fire and the lower part of my body feel like ice?" The doctor began to wish that they had not met. She was sure that he was teasing her, but he had such a charming manner that she found it impossible to be angry and could only smile. For a 3rd time, she tested him, and yet again found nothing at all wrong with him. And what," she said laughingly, "can I give someone who is not ill?" "Noble lady, your gamcha." Gesar pointed at the hat. The doctor laughed disbelievingly, then impulsively took it off her head and gave it to Gesar. Gesar called down the blessings of the gods on the doctor, for now he had another treasure of Guru Rinpoche. Swallows wove an invisible pattern in the limpid blue sky above the few remaining competitors in the race for the throne of Ling. Gesar knew that not only the swallows looked down from the heavens as he urged on his horse, for he was well up with the leaders in the race. As they rode through a narrow ravine, the high cliffs, eroded by wind and rain into patterns like the faces of strange beings, looked down upon them intently, broodingly. Gesar gained on the leaders. As the sound of his horse's hooves thundered in his ears, and seeing the cliffs, he thought for a second of how he had seen rock, stone harder than he could imagine, worn away by the gentle caress of water. As the riders emerged from the ravine, Gesar overtook most of the leaders. There were now only 2 competitors ahead of him, and the leader was Tonden's son, Dutsum. The 3 men pounded across the fields surrounding the town of Ling as they neared the finish. Suddenly, Gesar saw Dutsum's horse appear to stumble, then fall headlong. Dutsum managed to roll aside and avoid being crushed. Within seconds, he was on his feet, but a glance at his horse told him that while it was not seriously injured, he could not continue on it. Dutsum drew his dagger and raced toward the oncoming rider just ahead of Gesar. "Stop! I am Dutsum, the steward's son. I order you to stop." The rider slowed, undecided whether to stop. And as he came up to Dutsum, the young man, though of a portly build like his father, leaped at the rider, throwing him from his horse. Then Dutsum was in the saddle, urging the horse on to Ling, glancing back to see how close Gesar was. To his horror, he saw that Gesar had stopped and was walking toward his injured horse, dagger drawn with the evident intent of slitting its throat. Dutsum hesitated, but he could not ride on. He loved his horse too much. Turning back, he galloped toward Gesar. "Stop, Gesar. Please do not kill my horse." At that moment, while Dutsum was shouting, Gesar, on the horse of the gods, galloped into the marketplace to the delight of the crowd, who were delirious with excitement. Domo wept with joy and cried from the top of the temple steps, "Gesar, Gesar of Ling!" Gesar was carried to the steps by the crowd, their hero, the child of the gods, the banished young prince, for it is said by many that the nomad boy was the natural son of the late king. He had proven his right to his inheritance by winning the race. "Gesar, Gesar of Ling, Gesar, Gesar of Ling." The cry echoed through the town as he was hailed by the people. Gesar ordered the crowd to part and led his horse to a water trough. And then, surrounded by the chanting crowd, he loosened its girth and saw that a palace servant would look after the horse. Slowly, he mounted the steps to the temple. He embraced Doma and then Gongmo to wild cheers from the crowds. The head lama of the temple then assisted him to mount the throne of Ling. The royal robe was placed around his shoulders, and he accepted the symbols of sovereignty as the monastic trumpets and the great drum were sounded. Gesar stepped down from his throne and helped Doma onto the queen's throne. The crowd's welcome for their new queen was as warm as for their new king. One of the first to enter the marketplace after Gesar was Tonden. Just outside Ling, he had come across his son by his ailing horse and had learned how Gesar had used a phantom body to trick Dutsum into turning back. Tonden was helped off his horse. The crowd was noisy and not very friendly toward the steward. His buck teeth worked up and down as, panting for breath, the overweight steward climbed the temple step toward the throne. Tonden paused before Gesar, and the two looked at one another. Gesar smiled. Tonden laughed and felt very relieved. He stepped forward. "Nephew," Tonden bowed low, and this public acceptance of Gesar drew cheers from the crowd. Tonden draped a 6-foot-long kata over the throne, then turned to the crowd in the market square. "Today we have a new king. King Ling Gesar, Ling Gesar. Amidst the cheers, flintlocks exploded, and countless juniper incense fires were lit in thanksgiving as Tonden presented Doma, the Queen of Ling. Gesar smiled at Doma. A beautiful rainbow formed in the sky over the town. Gesar caught sight of the treasures on the table before him: the whip, the bow, the quiver, the hat. All were to play a part in his adventures, for Ling Gesar knew that in reality, his story had just barely begun. The end. I love that story. Gesar of Ling. So many lovely elements that are so typical of Tibetan culture. It just makes me smile and remember very clearly when I too was like that. I mean, not like Gesar, I couldn't do his things, but in Tibet, it was like that, really. And people's beliefs and their devotion to the deities and the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, unparalleled in our world. I'm so proud that I was among them, and I'm so proud to be an American today. Many blessings. See you tomorrow. We're going to begin again some lovely stories. Good night. Good night.